Okay, so now that we have a basic idea of how to draw the Lewis structures for simple as well as more complicated molecules, we're going to take a look at how we actually determine the three-dimensional shapes of these molecules. And the basis for determining shape of molecules in chemistry is what's known as the VSEPR theory. And VSEPR theory stands for the valence shell electron pair repulsion theory. So VSEPR, even though it's pronounced VSEPR. Okay, and this theory is based on very simple ideas. So it's based on the fact that your electron groups prefer to be as far apart from each other as possible in order to minimize the repulsion between them. Right, so again, there's a little bit of stability associated with this VSEPR theory, right? So if you minimize the repulsion, the shape is going to be most stable. So what are these electron groups that we're talking about? So an electron group can be a lone pair of electrons. It can be a single bond. It can be a double bond. Or it can be a triple bond. Right, so each of these counts as one electron group. And these, when you find them in the molecule, they want to be as far apart from each other as possible. The other thing to note about the VSEPR theory is that the shape is relative to the central atom, right? Whatever atom is at the very middle or the center of the molecule, we're going to use that as our frame of reference for determining the shape. So when we went through and we drew the Lewis structures for several molecules before, one of the steps was to determine what was at the middle of the molecule. So let's take a look at some examples of how we go through this process. We'll start off first of all with H2, and in H2, this was the simplest molecule possible. We saw that both H's were connected by a bond, right? So in this case, there is no central atom. There are just two atoms that are connected. So the only possible shape for this, for two things to be connected, is going to be a straight line, which we call linear. Right? So when you have only two atoms connected, the only possible shape is linear, whether it's an H and an H connected, or a fluorine and another fluorine in F2, or whether it's an HCl in hydrogen chloride. In the case of CO2, carbon dioxide, we went through and we drew this in class as well as in lab. You had to draw this, and we came up with a Lewis structure that looked like this, right? So carbon dioxide has C in the middle, and it's surrounded by two oxygens connected to them, each by a double bond. So when we look at the shape of this molecule, we're going to focus on the central atom, which is the carbon. And we're going to ask ourselves how many electron groups are around that central carbon. So we have one electron group here, which is a double bond, and we have another electron group. So we have a total of two electron groups around the central atom, which is the carbon in this case, right? We are not really concerned at all about the electrons, the lone pairs around the oxygens, because the oxygens are not central. So we're going to focus on what's in the middle. So those two electron groups around the central atom, in order for them to be as far apart as possible, the only shape that would be ideal would be, again, a straight line or linear, right? So when you look at the structure for carbon dioxide, it actually looks like a straight line. And as you may know, the bond angle in a straight line is 180 degrees. So we have to start with the correct Lewis structure before we're able to determine the shape of the molecule. So what about if we have more than two things or two electron groups around the central atom? So if we look here at the molecule called formaldehyde, so H2CO, right? So if we were to draw the Lewis structure for this, right, the first thing that we do is to determine the number of valence electrons. We have two hydrogens, which would give us 2 valence electrons. We have 1 carbon, gives us 4. And we have 1 oxygen, which gives us 6. So we add them together and we get 12 valence electrons. Right, so when we draw a structure, we should have a total of 12. We use a little bit of intuition and experience, and we know that we see carbon in a formula. We stick it in the middle, and then we have an O, and then we have 2 H's. Remember, H can only form 1 bond, so it has to be on the outside. We're going to connect everything with a line, and then we're going to give the outside atoms enough electrons to complete their octet. Remember, hydrogen is an exception. It only needs 2 electrons, and in this structure so far, it already has 2. So then we look at the oxygen. Right now it has 2 electrons, so it needs 6 more to complete its octet. Right, so if we check, right now we have a total of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 in our structure. So those are our 12 valence electrons. Our oxygens is happy with 8, the hydrogens are happy with 2, but the carbon right now only has 6. So the way that we address that is we're going to take a pair of electrons and move it in from the oxygen to make a double bond between the C and the O. Right, so we've made the carbon happy. We have our 12 valence electrons. That's our Lewis structure for formaldehyde. So then we focus in on the central carbon. Right, we have a total of 3 electron groups around it. We have the double bond here. We have a single bond connected to the H, and we have another single bond connected to the other H. So those 3 electron groups, in order for them to be as far apart as possible, will actually adopt a shape that looks like this. So it looks like a triangle. So we call it trigonal. And then it's flat, which would mean that it's planar, right? The planar term here means that it's a flat molecule. If we look at maybe a central atom with more than 3, so a central atom with 4 electron groups, right? We did methane or CH4 in class and in lab, and we've seen that the Lewis structure for this looks like that. So C in the middle with 4 H's around. So again, we focus on the central atom, carbon, and this has 4 electron groups around it. And out of those 4 electron groups, all 4 of them are bonded to atoms. Right? So the 4 electron groups will firstly adopt the most optimal shape, which would be a shape known as tetrahedral. Now, you were able to build the tetrahedral molecules in lab, and you saw that they had significant 3-dimensional nature to them, right? So when you draw your Lewis structure like this is a perfectly acceptable Lewis structure, but as you now know, it does not look flat. So the way that we represent that 3-dimensional nature of the tetrahedron would be to use this notation where you represent a bond coming out at you as a wedge, and then a bond going away from you as a dashed line. Right, so this gives a little bit of three-dimensional nature to it. If you think of this bond here, right, coming towards you, and this bond here going away from you, then you have the base of your tripod, and then you have your H sticking out from the top, right? So that's how we can represent something three-dimensionally on a flat surface like your paper or screen, for instance. We use the wedge and the dashed line notation to do that. So if we take a look at another example, so here we have ammonia, or NH3, and if we draw the Lewis structure for this, we see that it looks like that. Nitrogen in the middle with 3 H's around with the lone pair on top. And this also is something that we did in class and in lab. So again, if we focus on the central atom, which is our nitrogen, we have a total of 4 electron groups around it, right? And those 4 electron groups would be the lone pair, this bond here, that other bond, and then the 4th bond, right? So 4 electron groups around. Those electron groups, so the electronic group geometry, right, would be tetrahedral. Those electron groups will want to adopt that tetrahedral shape. But now the molecular geometry, we just look at the atoms involved. All right, so if we were to draw this, looking at all of those aspects of our structure, what we would see is that the ammonia and the shape of it looks like this. So again, we use our wedge and dash notation, right? So we have these bonds, this one here coming out towards you, and this one here going away from you. So those 3 bonds to hydrogen form the base of a pyramid that has 3 sides to the base. So we call this a trigonal pyramidal shape. And there is a significant 3-dimensional nature to it, as you know from the models that you made in class, right? So the molecular geometry, that's just a fancy way of saying the shape of the molecule. So in order to do that, you have to go through the process of drawing the Lewis structure, focusing on the central atom, and then looking at how many electron groups are around it. All right, so the last one here is H2O. So if we have our water molecule, we draw a Lewis structure, we know it looks like this. And then we have our lone pairs around. So again, our central atom here is going to have a total of 4 electron groups around it. Right, so we have this lone pair, we have that lone pair, we have this bond over here, and we have the 4th one over on that side. So your electron group geometry is also going to be tetrahedral, right? Those 4 things will want to be as far apart from each other as possible. But now the shape of the molecule is what we just look at in terms of the atoms. And the atoms, just the H's and the 2 O's, adopt this shape. And as you saw in class or in lab, that's a bent shape, right? And that results from having those 2 lone pairs up at the top that push the hydrogens down. So we can summarize the molecular shapes, the names of the shapes, based on how many electron groups are around the central atom, right? So this table, I gave you a copy of this in lab. Let's use it to go through the one that we just did, which was H2O. All right, so we saw that for water, there's a total of 4 electron groups around it, All right, so we look at our table, and that gets us down here. So we have 3 options to choose from. So those 4 electron groups will adopt that tetrahedral shape. Well, how many of those electron groups are lone pairs in water? And the answer is 2. Right, so we have 2 electron groups, these 2 lone pairs, sorry, which are those 2. And then we have 2 bonded atoms, which are the H's. So the shape that we get is our bent shape, which looks like our molecule up on top. So to summarize, when it comes to determining the molecular shapes, the first thing that you need to do is to come up with the correct Lewis structure. Then we're going to look at the central atom. And we're going to ask ourselves how many electron groups are around it. All right, and then we're going to use that to determine eventually the electronic geometry, right? How those electron groups are going to be arranged, and then finally the molecular geometry, which is just, again, a fancy word of saying the shape of the molecule. I wanted to show you a website that you can go to in the absence of having the models with you to work with. There's a website where there's some simulations and some examples of shapes of molecules. So you can type in phet.colorado.edu. It'll get you to this website. And if you click on simulations and you go down to chemistry, right here, there are a bunch of different chemistry simulations that you can go through, and I'll reference this as we get further down or further along in the semester, but I just want to preview this to you right now. If you scroll down to molecule shapes down here and you click on it, you can actually run this program right from the website itself. You don't have to download anything. So if you click on molecular shapes, it opens up the program, and then you can start choosing. Let's choose some real molecules. Let's say, oops, there we go. There's water pulled up first. So if you look at it, right, this is an example of H2O, and you can see there's the oxygen in the middle that's red. It's got 2 lone pairs on it, and it's got 2 hydrogens attached to it. And those 4 things, having 4 electron groups around it, will adopt an electronic geometry. If I click on that down here on the bottom, it tells me the electronic geometry is tetrahedral. Now the shape of the molecule itself, we just look at the atoms involved. And then if I click on molecule geometry, you'll see that it's bent, right? And that's what you actually built in lab this week. So you can go through and you can look at some of the other molecules. Here's CO2, carbon dioxide. You can move this around, you can pull it around. You can actually see that CO2 is linear, right? It's a straight line. And there's some other ones on here as well that we did in lab.